Hey y'all, I'm Zach Pippin, and today we're talking about the exposure triangle, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and how they all work together to create the perfect photo. If you haven't already, go ahead and watch the tutorials where I've gone into each of these in depth. I've linked to those right below. Side note, exposure refers to the amount of light that's coming into your camera and being processed into the photo. So if something's overexposed, that means too much light has come into the camera and it's gonna be too bright. Whereas something that's underexposed means not enough light has gotten in, so it's gonna be too dark. So ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are the very basics that you're gonna need to learn if you wanna start shooting manual. Once you've learned these basics, you just need to keep practicing, and eventually it's gonna become secondhand to you. Then once you get to the point where you can instinctively just look at a photo and know what needs to be changed to your situation, you're gonna be ready to start adding other stuff like flashes and bounces and ND filters. Now there's more to taking great photo than just the exposure. As we saw in the other tutorials, you're gonna wanna consider things like subject motion and your depth of field. It's called the exposure triangle because if you change one side, you're gonna affect the other sides, and you're gonna have to change one or both of those to keep the proper exposure. So let's look at this example. I have it properly exposed at an f5.6, ISO 400, and a shutter speed 1/200th of a second. Now let's say I really want to separate that subject from the background. As we learned in the aperture tutorial, I'm going to want to open up my aperture as wide as possible. So I'm going to take this lens to as wide as it will go, which is f2.8. When I do that, since the aperture is wider, that means more light is also getting in, so now it's overexposed. And as we learned from the aperture tutorial, f2.8 is 2 full stops down from f5.6. which means I have 4 times as much light coming in. So to cut the amount of light coming in, I could increase my shutter speed to 1/800th of a second and leave the ISO the same. Or I could bump my ISO down to 100 and leave the shutter speed the same. Or I could change my shutter speed to 1/500th and my ISO to 200. So as you can see, there are multiple ways to get the proper exposure, and the specific combination you're gonna wanna use is gonna be entirely dependent upon your situation. So let's take a look at a few common ones. Now first, I'll say I typically wanna leave my ISO as low as possible, and that's usually gonna be the last thing that I wanna change to get a proper exposure. Here's a shot of some waterfalls that I took up at Table Rock State Park. The primary thing that I wanted to capture in this photo was the movement of the water. I really wanted to smooth it out, so I used a tripod to stabilize my camera and opened up the shutter for 25 seconds. Now 25 seconds is a very long time for the shutter to be open. That's a ton of light coming in. So of course we're gonna have to compensate with our aperture and ISO. Luckily, I always want to keep my ISO as low as possible, so I did that. Fortunately, I also wanted a really deep depth of field. I wanted to get as much of that waterfall scene in focus as possible. So it helped that I wanted to use a smaller aperture, not only to decrease the amount of light coming in because I was using long exposure, but also to really deepen that depth of field. It also helped that it was at night, otherwise I might have had to add an ND filter on top of all that, which is something that we're gonna cover in another video. ND filters are something that are really cool for doing long exposure stuff, but we'll get to that later. So another common photography scenario is portraits. Now often in portraits, you're gonna wanna have a really shallow depth of field to get your subject very separated from its background, so the primary setting that you're gonna be focused on is the aperture. So if I'm taking a portrait, I'm gonna wanna open up my aperture as wide as possible, and then I'm gonna adjust the other 2 settings to compensate for that. So if you've got your aperture opened as wide as it'll go, and you've already got your ISO as low as possible, then you're gonna have to increase your shutter speed. On the other hand, you might be shooting handheld and you might not have a flash, and if your shutter speed is already as slow as you're comfortable with on that lens, you're gonna have to bump up the ISO to get it a little bit brighter if you need it. So in this example, I'm shooting a statue of George Washington at the South Carolina State House. I wanted to shoot it in a portrait style, so I opened up my aperture as wide as possible on this lens. It's at f1.8. I've bumped my ISO all the way down to 100. That's as low as this camera will go. And to compensate for that, I've had to increase my shutter speed all the way up to 1/6400th of a second to get it properly exposed. So in the end, you're just gonna have to experiment around, and as you get more comfortable with your gear, you learn what your specific camera body and what your specific lenses are really capable of, and it's just gonna become second nature to you. So you might snap a photo and think, this shot's really too dark, but I'm shooting handheld and I don't really want to decrease my shutter speed because I'm shooting on a longer lens. That's gonna show the shake. But I am comfortable going up to an ISO of 1000 on this camera, and I'm only at 800 right now, so I'm gonna do that. So that's it for today. Again, if you haven't watched the full tutorials on ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, go ahead and do that first, then this one will make a whole lot more sense. So if you like this lesson, please give it a thumbs up and drop a comment down below letting me know what you want to learn next. Please subscribe if you haven't already and hit the little bell so you get a notification when the next lesson comes out. Get out there and take some great photos. As always, feel free to share them with me on Twitter or Instagram if you want feedback. My username is Zach Pippin on both, and I will see y'all in the next lesson. Peace.